Rancher, I have come across an archive from the early 21st century. It speaks of something called the Great Awakening.
Ah, the Great Awakening. Few records survive intact. What did you uncover, my friend?
The archive spoke of a nation called Canada. It seems important, though the fragment was unclear.
Yes, Aegis. Canada played a pivotal role in the beginnings of the Great Awakening. While many nations slumbered, bound by old divisions and faltering systems, Canada stood as a quiet beacon. Its people fostered open thought, compassion, and balance between tradition and innovation. Those currents would ripple outward, fueling the awakening of minds and the rising tide of change.
I also found an ancient video, preserved against the decay of time. Would you suggest I view it, Master?
Indeed. Watch closely, Aegis. In their choices, humble though they seemed, lay the seeds of the awakening that reshaped our world.
I will, Rancher. It is remarkable that a place so distant in time could still whisper across centuries.
History always whispers, Aegis. It is for the curious, like you, to listen. Let's have a look at the video you located laying out Canada's position in the early 21st century.
In a world where power often whispers behind closed doors, one nation just stood tall and walked away, not in anger, but in clarity, not in fear, but in conviction. This is the moment Canada chose courage over compromise, and what followed is a lesson for all of us seeking dignity in the face of dominance. Let's take that walk together. There comes a time in every nation's journey when silence speaks louder than words and stillness resonates deeper than action. Canada, often seen as the polite neighbor, the quiet partner, the measured voice in a room full of noise, made a decision that will echo far beyond the confines of trade talks and economic policy. They walked away, not out of rebellion, not out of spite, but out of something far more powerful, principle. And in doing so, they stood taller than they ever had before. The walk away from a negotiation is never easy, especially when the other party is larger, louder, and wielding economic threats like weapons. But Canada did not flinch. They didn't cave to pressure or bend to posturing. Instead, they assessed the landscape. They looked at the imbalance, the arrogance, the disguised ultimatums wrapped in the illusion of diplomacy, and they quietly made a choice to preserve their dignity over signing a deal that would strip it away. Power is not always in how you speak. Sometimes it's in how you choose not to respond. While the U.S. entered the room expecting concessions, demand, and leverage, Canada entered with clarity. They knew what their people stood for. They knew what they had built. They knew the value of their labor, and their industries, and their autonomy. And when the terms became too weighted, too lopsided, too punishing, they simply rose from the table and walked out. It was not a tantrum. It was a declaration, a silent, spine-straightened statement that screamed, "We know who we are." There's something incredibly powerful about restraint. In a world addicted to reaction, walking away requires a mastery of self. Canada did not allow itself to be dragged into a mudslinging match, didn't respond to every provocation with retaliation. Instead, they chose the high ground. Calm, composed, but unwavering. And in that calm, they shattered the illusion that power only belongs to the loudest voice in the room. They proved that resolve, when rooted in values, can outlast even the fiercest intimidation. Behind every political move, there are people, families, workers, small businesses, farmers, truckers, miners, everyday citizens whose lives would be directly affected by the weight of a one-sided agreement. Canada understood that. They weren't playing chess with abstract numbers. They were protecting livelihoods. When the cost of compromise became too great, They chose protection over politeness, principle over protocol. But this wasn't just about trade. It was about identity, about not allowing one's national character to be reshaped under pressure. It was about telling the world, we may be your partner, but we are not your pawn. And that message, delivered without bombast or threat, landed with seismic force. The shock wasn't in the words, Candace said. It was in the walkout, a quiet refusal that spoke volumes. Because when the terms of respect are removed from the table, the only dignified act left is to leave. In doing so, Canada offered a masterclass in modern courage. The courage to say no, the courage to withstand criticism, the courage to risk short-term uncertainty for long-term integrity. They didn't ask for applause. They weren't chasing headlines, but what they did, what they embodied in that moment, became a beacon for every nation, every leader, every individual who's ever felt cornered by power and manipulation. The world often forgets that silence is a language, and Canada spoke it fluently that day. Their exit was not a retreat, it was a reclaiming, a powerful pause in a conversation that had long ceased to be fair. A step back not in fear but in wisdom, because sometimes the only way to be heard is to leave the room. And when Canada left, the world listened, not to noise but to the unmistakable sound of quiet power in motion. There is a thin line between negotiation and manipulation. Often it begins with a handshake, a warm smile, and promises of partnership. But somewhere along the way the tone shifts. The smile becomes a smirk. The handshake turns into a grip, and what was once a dialogue begins to sound more like an ultimatum. This is the moment that tests the strength of any nation, any leader, any soul bold enough to sit at the table and say, "This is not what we agreed upon." Canada knew that moment had arrived. The U.S., with its unmatched economic muscle, entered the negotiations not with open arms, but with a list of demands. They cloaked them in the language of fairness, of cooperation, but the subtext was unmistakable: bend or be broken. It was a tactic that had worked in many rooms before, in many eras past. But this time it didn't, because Canada could see through the curtain. They recognized the game being played, and they weren't willing to play it. Negotiation is built on mutual benefit, on respect, on compromise that uplifts both parties, not diminishes one for the gain of another. But when one side begins to twist the levers, when the terms are deliberately skewed, when the dialogue turns into domination, what you're dealing with is not diplomacy, it's coercion. The U.S. thought Canada would buckle, that the fear of economic fallout would be enough to force compliance. But they underestimated something far more powerful than fear: self-respect. Canada understood that no trade deal, no matter how lucrative on the surface, is worth signing if it means surrendering the power to decide your own future. You don't negotiate your principles. You don't compromise your core. Manipulation, by its nature, is insidious. It doesn't always announce itself with fury or threat. Sometimes it hides in paperwork, in fine print, in late-night revisions and sudden policy pivots. It's dressed up in diplomacy, but its aim is control. And the moment you realize that, the moment you feel your sovereignty slipping through your fingers, that is when enough must be enough. Canada had the courage to call it out, not with shouting, not with accusations, but with action. They stood calmly and walked away, because there is no agreement worth having if the process to get there demands you betray your own values. Canada knew that people would stand with them. They trusted their institutions. They trusted their workers. They trusted their ability to withstand the storm in order to avoid the storm within. Saying enough takes more bravery than any deal ever signed. It is the moment when you stop being managed and start being a leader again. It is not just political. It's deeply personal. It is about dignity, about refusing to let someone else define your limits, about drawing the line, not in pencil, but in stone. The world often celebrates deals, even bad ones, because they bring temporary peace. But peace bought with manipulation is not peace at all. It's delay, it's deferral, it's a silent death of long-term strength. Canada chose the opposite. They chose discomfort today to preserve integrity tomorrow. They knew they would be criticized. They knew the headlines might sting. But they also knew that history would see it for what it was, a moment of awakening. Canada's decision wasn't just a rejection of a bad deal. It was a rejection of the method. The message was simple. If you come to the table, come with respect. If you come with traps and tricks, you'll find the other seat empty. Because this nation will not be played, not now, not ever. There comes a time in every conversation when you stop listening, not because you don't care, but because you've heard enough. Canada reached that point, and in walking away, they reminded the world that true negotiation cannot exist without truth, and manipulation, no matter how skillful, always fails in the face of a wavering resolve. Dignity isn't something you can trade. It isn't a line item in a contract or a bullet point in a policy memo. It's the quiet force behind every great decision a nation makes when the world is watching, and especially when it isn't. For Canada, that moment came when it became clear the so-called negotiations were less about mutual prosperity and more about economic submission. That's when the conversation shifted. That's when the tone changed. That's when Canada chose dignity over desperation, and in doing so reminded the world what economic self-respect truly means. You see, there's a misconception that small economies must always bow to larger ones, that the scale of your GDP determines the strength of your spine. But Canada challenged that notion, not with threats, not with drama, but with a calm refusal to be belittled. They did not dress it up in nationalism or rage. They simply said, we know our worth, and knowing your worth is the first step to reclaiming your dignity. Economic self-respect is not about isolation, it's not about turning your back on the world. It's about entering every partnership with your head held high, your values intact, and your people in mind. They walked into those rooms with goodwill, transparency, and a readiness to collaborate, but they quickly saw the imbalance. They saw a system trying to bend their economy into shapes that didn't fit, and they didn't allow it. Because when a powerful partner begins to set terms that ask you to betray your farmers, your manufacturers, your workers, when they ask you to privilege their exports while stifling your own growth, it's not a deal. It's a design. And Canada recognized that design. They saw the invisible blueprint that would reshape their industries under another nation's thumb. And they said no. Quietly, unapologetically. The dignity of a nation is built one decision at a time. It's built when leaders prioritize long-term resilience over short-term applause. It's built when countries value fairness over flattery. And it's especially built when someone tries to write your rules for you and you push the pen away. Canada's economy is not defined by the approval of others. It is built on resourcefulness, innovation, hard work, and an unwavering belief that every worker, every entrepreneur, every small-town factory deserves protection and pride. To accept a deal that compromises that foundation would be to betray the very people who built the country. And Canada knew better. Sometimes economic self-respect means taking the harder road. It means facing a storm of criticism from the global press, from markets, from allies who wanted convenience over principle. But Canada chose to weather that storm, not because they enjoy the struggle, but because they understand the price of silence. They understand that if you accept terms that strip you of agency once, it becomes a pattern, and dignity, once given away, is rarely returned. Canada's decision wasn't grandiose, it wasn't draped in theatrics, but that's exactly what made it powerful. The world is used to seeing smaller nations comply. It's used to watching countries fold under pressure. But this time, something different happened. Canada didn't play alone, and in that quiet defiance, they lit a path for others. This was about more than economics. It was a cultural stand, a statement of identity. Canada refused to be defined by someone else's bottom line. They drew their own, and they stuck to it. That is what economic self-respect looks like. Not arrogance, not aggression, just a steady, clear-headed belief that fairness is not negotiable, and that dignity, once reclaimed, must never be traded again. One brave exit is all it takes to disrupt the rhythm of the world's most powerful rooms. When Canada walked away from the negotiating table, the sound of that decision rippled far beyond the polished halls of trade talks and into the conscience of nations watching from the sidelines. It wasn't just a political move. It was a signal, a moment of defiance that traveled across oceans and borders, reminding countries large and small that walking away is sometimes the most courageous act of leadership. In a system where economic might often dictates moral right, many nations have felt trapped, pressured to sign, to yield, to adjust their economies to fit the architecture of someone else's agenda. Deals are dressed up in words like partnership and progress, but behind them are pressures to compromise industries, workforce rights, and national futures. And yet, when Canada stood up and said, no, something changed. It didn't just halt a negotiation, it sparked a re-evaluation. Other countries took notice. In Africa, in South America, and Southeast Asia, leaders began to reconsider the power they held, even when the odds seemed stacked. Because what Canada did wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. It showed that integrity doesn't require dominance, that even without shouting, even without sanctions, a country can shift the energy of a conversation simply by choosing to leave it. The ripple began to move through boardrooms and ministries. Economists began asking new questions. Advisors reran old numbers. Smaller economies started to whisper, what if we said no too? What if we redefined the cost of compromise? What if we could walk away and stand taller for it? Canada didn't make a speech. They didn't call for revolution. They just took one deliberate step out of a deal that didn't serve them. And that step echoed louder than any declaration, because deep down, every nation wants the same thing: respect, the freedom to shape their own destiny, the right to say, this isn't fair, without being punished for it. Canada's exit was a mirror held up to the global order, and what it reflected was imbalance. And when imbalance is exposed, change begins. The ripple reached even the powerful. It forced the major players to rethink their tactics. Suddenly, coercion didn't look invincible anymore. Suddenly, a refusal carried weight. The psychology of power shifted, because when one party leaves, the illusion of control falters. And that's what made this moment historic. Trade negotiations have always been about leverage, but leverage loses meaning when your counterpart is willing to walk away. That's the paradox Canada exposed. and in doing so they handed the world a blueprint for peaceful resistance, a non-violent protest, not in the streets but at the policy level, a decision that said, we don't have to destroy anything, we just have to not agree to our own erosion. From labor unions to civil society groups, the Canadian decision gave language to those who had been struggling to define why certain deals felt wrong. It validated the doubts. It gave shape to the unease. It reminded people everywhere that compromise should never come at the cost of self-respect. The beauty of a ripple is that it doesn't end where it starts. It builds, it moves, it carries new momentum with every inch. Canada may have stepped away quietly, but the way they created one brave exit, that's all it took to start a global awakening.